Chapter 8. Cale craned his neck to see over the throng of people preparing for the feast of Deju. They hung bows of flowers and shrubbery from one cramped building to another. Large white columns rose above the inner courtyard, like sentries guarding the way to the king's castle. Tantalizing smells of fresh-baked bread and roasting pig saturated the air. Cale's stomach twisted in hunger, but food would have to wait. He plunged through the crowd. Somewhere in all the commotion he would find Nevin Darin. A half-giant would be difficult to miss. A dull, throbbing ache continued to assault his arm and nerves as Cale made his way toward the great hall. Ayianna had cleaned it well under the circumstances, but was it good enough? He'd have to visit the apothecary later. His pace slowed. Without the dire need to defend himself or another, a sleep-deprived, battle-weary haze seized his mind and consumed his energy. At least he wasn't having to keep an eye on the girl. She would have slowed him down, and he didn't have time for playing nursemaid. Despite Desmond's timely arrival, the lack of having her near bugged him. Was it the promise to her brother, or was it her overwhelming grief? A grief that mirrored his own. He'd check on her later. Not that she wasn't in capable hands by the look of Desmond's attire and forthrightness. Still, the situation nagged him. Why hadn't Darin mentioned the betrothal? Her brother's ring! How could he have forgotten? He had to return it to her. Another reason for him to check on her. "Pardon us," a gruff voice said behind him. Cale's attention snapped to the present. He stood in the middle of the road, blocking traffic. He shook his head and stepped out of the way of a group of humans carrying a long table. He had to focus. Wreaths of pine and cedar adorned the long rows of tables for the king and his guests. A disjointed melody lifted above the clamor of the crowd as a group of minstrels practiced with their lutes and horns. An 8-foot-tall man appeared out of nowhere. Cale pushed toward him. The half-giant's voice thundered over the others as he instructed various servants on matters pertaining to tomorrow's festival. Dressed in leather pants and a sleeveless buckskin vest, Darin towered above the people. He was bald and wore a dark patch over his right eye. His other eye studied his surroundings and then rested on Cale. Cale touched his fingertips together and bowed. "Brazam, Nevin Darin." "Brazam, Cale," Darin replied as he grasped Cale's shoulder and tipped his head. "You look terrible. What brings you to Badera?" "Urgent matters. May we speak in private?" "Yes, of course. King Valdemar has provided the guardians with a small study when we are here in Badera. We may use it." After delegating a few tasks, Darin led Cale to the North Tower, where a flight of stone steps spiraled up to a cramped study furnished with a desk, a few shelves, and a loft for sleeping. Darin's towering frame took up most of the room and dwarfed the scant oak furniture. "Home away from home," Darin smiled and patted the loft straw mattress. "It is meager, but it serves its purpose. Centuries ago, when Badera had looked to the guardians for tutoring their young princes, you would have found a much bigger room and not located in some far tower. Alas, times are changing. Priorities change." He sat down on a bench, his knees nearly reaching his shoulders. He motioned for Cale to sit. "What urgent matters have brought you here?" Cale shook his head and tightened his grip on his sword belt. 2 nights ago, Dagmar was attacked. Imarin, one of the pupils finishing his second phase, stole the sacred pearl and fled with the aid of a dragon. The school has been ransacked. The secret vaults have been opened and their contents stolen. Secret wants you to notify the other guardians and to form an assembly." Darin's brow furrowed, cutting deep grooves into his forehead. He did not avert his gaze, but simply stared at Cale as if he could relive the battle through another's memory. Cale shuddered. He swallowed the lump in his throat and waited. Darin leaned forward, and an ebony pendant set in twisted silver dangled from his neck. The Lengia. All the guardians had one, except Said. He had 2. "What about Unai and the other teachers, the pupils?" "Many are dead. I don't know what became of Unai. Said thinks he might have tried to get some of the students to safety. To where, I don't know. We didn't see him or anybody else on our way south. Saeed is seeking audience with the king as we speak, and then will meet us here this evening if all goes well. Good luck with that. The king has not been seeing anyone these past couple of days. His officials claim he has been busy mediating between the Nuja pilgrimages and the festival goers. Well, I'm certain the destruction of Dagmar will demand his attention. Darin frowned. I doubt it, unless it proves a threat to him personally. Any idea who did this? No, but the Musul banner hangs in the school. The Musul, you say? Darin rubbed his bald head. A leather vambrance wrapped around his forearm and curved to a point toward his fingers. Runes of Payamar, the Powhatan language, scrawled across the large knuckles of his hand. What kind of a fool would do such a thing? Imarin. I doubt he did it by himself. Cale shrugged. I didn't recognize the men, if they were men, nor their colors, red and black. You said he escaped by dragon? Cale nodded. He walked over to the narrow window and looked out. Beyond the curtain wall, clumps of autumn trees and evergreens littered the edge of the plains. He could see nothing of the festival decorations or the people. Darin hadn't been jesting when he said this was the far tower. He turned to Darin. Do you think the Kaelaki are in on it? No. They would never go against the old alliance, even if the other nations break away. The Kaelaki will not. Darin put his hands behind his head and leaned against the wall. He gazed up at the high ceiling for a while, then turned his attention back to Cale. If the items in the vault are gone, then I would have to assume whoever is in charge has their sights on dark things. Cale's eyes narrowed. What was in those vaults? Well, the Book of Records, which is really just history and genealogies. I doubt that will be much use to them. No, it is the Tukwa scrolls I'm concerned about. They could be dangerous in the wrong hands. They are full of incantations and curses. The first Guardian Circle claimed they belonged to Lord Stygian himself. The words in those scrolls are the very breath of the Toaz Dekon, and they stand in complete opposition to the Enso Tanil. Why did Saeed have him at the school in the first place? Darin fingered the pendant hanging from his neck. The headmaster before him used those scrolls to instruct pupils on matters pertaining what some call the corruptive gifts. He believed guardians needed to know what they were up against in case the perimeter was to fail or someone unleashed the Toaz from the underworld. Made sense, coming from his day and age, but Saeed disagreed. He thought that only guardians accepted into the circle should have access to that information. Guardians who have proven themselves trustworthy and have received their gifting from Vutuko. Therefore, when Saeed became headmaster, he locked the scrolls in the vault, and only those within the circle know about them. Then how did Imarin know about them? Darin shook his head. Your guess is as good as mine, but someone must have told him. Cale sat down in the chair and closed his eyes. His head was starting to spin. He had too much to process right now, and he didn't want to think about the implications of Darin's words. He opened his eyes. After studying him for a moment, Darin rubbed his face and stood. I will alert the others. It'll probably be a month before we can convene. He clasped his pendant. Do you know if Saeed contacted Nerissa yet? Cale shook his head. He refuses to use the Lengia, and asks you to do the same. Saeed suspects one of us, then. Darin walked over to the desk and pulled out an inkwell, quill, and a piece of parchment. He scrawled a note. Cale was only half aware of Darin's presence next to him. The scratching of the quill kept his conscience anchored to the tower. He longed to release the tension, the grief, to sleep and wake up from this nightmare. The scratching stopped, and Cale blinked his eyes. Had he nodded off? A large golden eagle dropped from the height of the ceiling and landed on Darin's vambrance. He stroked the feathers and murmured softly as he secured a small silver tube to one of its legs. Then the eagle stretched its wings and took flight, soaring out of the tower's narrow window. Darin's hand clamped on Cale's shoulder. Sleep, friend. I've got to make sure everything is ready for the festival. Cale nodded. Darin ducked out of the room, leaving Cale alone with his muddled thoughts. Exhaustion weighed upon him like a heavy fur blanket. He crawled into the loft and collapsed.